The salt wind off Marblehead Harbor always carried the sound of entitlement. It was a cold, cutting wind that matched the words my father, Richard Hayes, was currently spitting at me from behind the massive oak door of his precious ancestral home. "Leave, Clara, just like your mother did." His voice didn't just carry across the cobblestones. It echoed the self-pity and manufactured victimhood he had refined over 30 years. I stood on the worn granite porch, the intricate iron scrollwork of the Hayes H emblem cold against my palm. I was wearing a sharp, tailored coat, ready for the business I had traveled 600 miles to handle, but he saw only the ghost of the rebellious girl he'd chased away a decade ago. "You never learned to respect what this family built," he hissed, his face a mask of disappointment perfected by years of practicing it in the mirror. "You've wasted your education, your bloodline, everything for cheap antiques and dusty museums. Now I'm done. Take your advice and go. We don't need the drama of a daughter who thinks she's above us." Every word was designed to chip away at the foundation of my self-worth, the same strategy he'd used to dismantle my mother, piece by calculated piece until she vanished. But I wasn't the girl who had cried in the passenger seat of her beat-up sedan when she left for college. I was Clara Hayes, 35, a specialist in hidden value and inconvenient truths. I didn't flinch. I just let him finish, the silence after his words thick with the history of a family built on beautiful lies. I reached up and carefully adjusted the delicate gold pin on my lapel, a tiny replica of the goddess of justice, a silent reminder of what was about to happen. I had come here not for a fight, but for an execution. This whole conversation, this entire staged dismissal, was merely the overture. The real drama, the one designed to collapse his entire world, was waiting just down the street. I was about to give him the exit he demanded, but it wouldn't be on my terms. It would be on my mother's. Before I could even turn my heel, before I could let the cold New England air fill the space where his words hung, a car pulled up the winding driveway. Not a sleek, modern vehicle, but a meticulously maintained 1980s Saab, the kind of classic car that only someone who valued preservation over flash would drive. The driver's side door opened and out stepped Amelia Hayes, my mother, looking exactly as I remembered her, elegant, fiercely composed, and holding a worn leather portfolio like a shield. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back from her face, revealing eyes the color of the Atlantic on a stormy day. My father froze, his self-pity instantly replaced by stark, animal fear. It was the first time he had seen her in 20 years. She hadn't aged. She had simply hardened into an unbreakable sculpture of resilience. "Richard," she said, her voice a low, level note that cut through the harbor wind. "I'm not here for you. I'm here for my daughter. And for the truth you've spent half your life trying to bury under the veneer of your precious family legacy." The entire neighborhood, with its manicured lawns and silent disapproval, was about to become the audience for the biggest scandal Marblehead had seen in a generation. The truth about their divorce wasn't just devastating. It was a carefully constructed legal weapon, and my mother had arrived to fire the first shot. Before we dive into the wreckage of the Hayes family, I need to know, have you ever felt completely isolated, like the only sane person in a room full of people who refuse to see the truth? Let me know in the comments below. Your stories keep this community alive. And trust me, you are going to want to stick around to the very end to see how my father's arrogance finally became his absolute undoing. My father's fear was a raw, visceral thing, completely foreign to the man who usually wore his control like a bespoke suit. He sputtered, backing away from the threshold, the massive oak door now seeming too small to hide his panic. He finally managed to choke out a single pathetic question that contained the entirety of his ego. "Amelia, what have you done?" But Mom didn't answer him. She walked straight past him as if he were a piece of antique furniture she was too busy to appraise, locking eyes with me. There was a lifetime of apology and unspoken solidarity in that look. I stepped down from the porch, meeting her halfway on the worn flagstone path. It was a quiet exchange, a transfer of power from the exiled queen to her loyal soldier. The story of the Hayes family, and indeed of Marblehead itself, was one of inherited status and carefully managed appearances. We weren't the wealthiest family on the North Shore, but we were the oldest. Richard Hayes lived and breathed the legacy of the town's maritime history, his failing yacht brokerage built on a name that had owned half the docks 2 centuries ago. My childhood was a carefully curated display. Sailing lessons at the Corinthian Yacht Club, prep school in Andover, and Christmas cards featuring the perfect family standing in front of the house that had been in the Hayes name since the 1790s. But behind the colonial facade, there was a hierarchy built on Richard's insecurities. My brother Ethan, 3 years my junior, was the golden son, the one who went to Harvard, the one who was supposed to take over the yacht brokerage, the one who mattered. I was simply the intellectual diversion, the daughter who dared to pursue a degree in art history and conservation at Boston University instead of settling for a manageable marriage and the junior league. Richard tolerated me only because I was good at keeping secrets and solving problems quietly. He often used me as an unpaid consultant, needing my expert eye to authenticate antique nautical charts or appraise obscure decorative arts that clients used as collateral. I had the education he valued, but the personality he despised. I saw the world not through the lens of lineage, but through the hard, unblinking truth of provenance, material, and value. He'd never truly forgiven my mother for the divorce, not because he missed her, but because her departure had ripped a hole in his perfect narrative. He had spun the story for 2 decades. Amelia was the flighty artist, the irresponsible dreamer who couldn't handle the pressure of the Hayes name, who ran off to New York to pursue a career that never materialized, leaving him to raise 2 children alone. He had even secured sole custody, painting himself as the selfless, long-suffering father. It was a beautiful lie, laminated and framed in the town's collective memory. But every curator knows that the most valuable object in a collection is often the one that's been deliberately hidden or mislabeled. In our family, that object was the truth about the divorce, and the lie was rooted in the house itself. I'd left for good 3 years ago, finally escaping the suffocating atmosphere of his perpetual martyrdom to establish my own small, highly respected appraisal firm in Beacon Hill. My father believed I was chasing a fantasy. What he didn't know was that every piece of art I had authenticated, every legal document I had scrutinized for a client, was just practice for this day. I learned to look past the patina of age, past the forged signatures, past the decades of smoke and mirrors. I learned to identify the genuine article, and I knew Richard Hayes was a counterfeit. When he told me to leave, like your mother did, he wasn't just being cruel. He was attempting to reassert the narrative that justified his entire miserable existence. He wanted me to internalize the shame that wasn't mine. He wanted me to believe that Amelia was a failure, a cautionary tale. But I knew better. My mother's arrival was the beginning of the end of his fictional empire, and I felt the cold, hard satisfaction of a 10-year plan finally clicking into place. The truth in our world wasn't just a moral concept. It was a notarized document, an authenticated bill of sale, and a recorded deed. And the documents in my mother's portfolio were about to be read aloud, not in a courtroom, but right here, on the doorstep of the house he thought defined him. The crowd of curious neighbors was growing, drawn by the sound of Richard's panicked voice and the sight of the notorious Amelia Hayes. This was the stage. The house itself, that grand colonial on Lafayette Street, was always the first character in any family drama. It wasn't just brick and mortar. It was the physical representation of the Hayes legacy, a deep well of cultural capital that my father desperately used to mask his financial incompetence. But the true irreplaceable value of the house wasn't in the land or the architecture. It was in a single item Richard had always overlooked, an object he viewed as a mere prop in his stage-managed life: a painting. It was a mid-18th century maritime landscape, a small, unassuming oil on canvas, tucked away in the back library, perpetually covered in a fine layer of dust. Richard believed it was a good reproduction, a quaint piece that complemented the Federalist decor. He was wrong. The painting, titled The Calm Before the Squall, was a minor but authenticated piece by a famous early American painter, Fitzhenry Lane. It was an inheritance from my mother's side, a secret that Amelia had kept locked away, a contingency plan for a life with a man she knew, deep down, valued image over integrity. The painting was hers, passed down through her maternal line, and she had meticulously documented its provenance before the marriage. This was the devastating truth about their divorce. 20 years ago, Richard's first major venture, a speculative investment in a Newport dry dock, collapsed spectacularly. He was facing bankruptcy, the shame of which would have been an emotional death sentence for him. He desperately needed $1.8 million to cover the debt and save his name. He didn't ask Amelia for help. He didn't admit his failure. Instead, he systematically dismantled her. Amelia, the quiet artist, had always handled the house accounts. Richard, leveraging the fog of their collapsing marriage and a power of attorney she had signed years earlier for estate planning, forged her signature on a private sale agreement for the calm before the squall. He sold it discreetly, through a private broker in Connecticut who specialized in off-market transactions. The buyer was a shadowy collector, the transaction clean and untraceable to Richard's immediate accounts. The money vanished into his business debt, saving the Hayes name while destroying Amelia's peace. To cover the theft, he systematically drained their joint accounts, making it appear that Amelia had impulsively withdrawn the funds for her frivolous art career before fleeing to New York. He fabricated a trail of expensive but easily refutable art supply invoices and studio rental agreements. By the time the divorce papers were served, he had already established the narrative of the irresponsible, flighty wife who had stolen their capital and abandoned their children for her selfish pursuits. He didn't just take her money, he took her reputation and her children's belief in her. I remembered the tearful phone call from a tiny, echoey studio in Soho, my mother trying to explain that the money was gone, but she hadn't taken it. I was 15, and Richard's polished, self-righteous anger had already inoculated me against her truth. He had convinced me that her leaving was the ultimate betrayal. For 2 decades, I carried the weight of his narrative, seeing my mother as the source of our family's brokenness. My teenage decision to reject his business path for art conservation wasn't just a career choice. It was a subconscious attempt to understand the world my mother had been exiled from. I spent my 20s learning the language of forgery, of material degradation, of historical misrepresentation, skills that were now razor-sharp and about to be deployed against the man who taught me the first, most important lesson: never trust the official story. My career became the quiet, meticulous revenge, the decade-long acquisition of the tools I needed to expose the fraud he had built his life upon. Every brushstroke I examined, every legal deed I filed, was a step toward this moment, toward peeling back the layers of varnish on Richard Hayes's perfectly crafted lie. The cultural significance of the Hayes name was built on a stolen canvas, and today, that painting was coming home, not to hang, but to incinerate his credibility. My preparation for this day began 10 years ago, long before I even consciously knew what I was doing. It started the day I walked into the archives at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, and saw a document that shattered my father's story. I was an intern, cataloging the papers of a minor New England collector, when I stumbled upon a letter detailing the acquisition of the calm before the squall. The letter, dated 3 months after my parents' divorce filing, mentioned the private broker, the Connecticut transaction, and most damningly, an enclosed note from R. Hayes, confirming the non-titled nature of the sale, emphasizing its secrecy, and requesting payment be split between 2 accounts, one a legitimate trust, and the other an offshore account used to settle the yacht debt. I didn't steal the letter. I simply photographed every page, meticulously. That day I stopped being an intern and started being an intelligence operative. The core of my plan was not to recover the money, which was long gone, but to prove the moral turpitude of the divorce and, more importantly, to seize the ultimate asset that Richard had spent 20 years protecting, the Marblehead house itself. The house had always been my mother's single regret. The only thing she truly loved, that Richard had successfully weaponized against her, making it the emblem of her failure to commit to the Hayes legacy. The strategy was complex, surgically precise, and required my specific expertise in both art law and property trusts. I spent the next decade creating what I called the Amelia Trust, a self-funded, irrevocable trust with a single, highly specific purpose. The key was a little-known Massachusetts law concerning ancestral property and proven financial fraud within a divorce settlement. I used my deep network within the high-end art world. Through a former colleague, I located the current owner of the Calm Before the Squall, a reclusive collector in San Diego. It took 4 years of careful negotiation, but I finally convinced him to sell me back the painting, at a significant markup, under the condition that the sale was registered with the state, creating a new official provenance chain that explicitly referenced the original fraudulent sale document I had found. I paid for it with every bonus, every commission, every penny I saved, ensuring the payment trail was clean. Then came the legal maneuver. I didn't sue Richard for the $1.8 million. I did something much more devastating. I used the recovered, re-authenticated painting, now indisputably worth $2.1 million, as the sole non-liquid asset of the Amelia Trust. Then, using the irrefutable evidence of the fraudulent 20-year-old sale, my photographed documents, I filed a quiet title action on the Marblehead property. This specific action leveraged the concept that the house's mortgage had been cross-collateralized with Richard's yacht business during a refinancing in the late 90s, using the expected value of the painting as an informal, unsecured asset guarantee. By proving the sale of the painting was fraudulent and that the divorce settlement was based on a lie of financial abandonment, I could argue that the entire property's current legal status was contaminated by financial misrepresentation dating back decades. The quiet title action didn't aim to take the house. It aimed to freeze Richard's ability to borrow against it, sell it, or even live in it without a full public accounting of his financial past. The timing had to be perfect. The day Richard told me to leave was the day the final paperwork was due to be served. My mother's arrival wasn't just to deliver the truth. She was carrying the notarized, stamped, and recorded deed to the calm before the squall, proving its re-entry into the family under the Amelia Trust. The vengeance was pure. Richard had used the painting to save his name and frame his wife. I was using the painting to destroy his name and free his wife. The final setup was a masterpiece of orchestrated inevitability, perfectly executed in the quintessential New England chill. I had arranged for the delivery of the legal papers not through a standard process server, but through my mother, Amelia, ensuring maximum emotional impact and minimizing Richard's ability to retreat. We didn't need a courtroom. The Hayes front porch, with its audience of scandalized neighbors peering through lace curtains, was the only jury that mattered. To ensure the complete humiliation necessary for a true viral story, I had taken one additional crucial step. Richard was expecting his chief lending officer, Mr. Peterson, from the Salem State Bank, to arrive that afternoon for what he believed was a routine annual review of the brokerage's dwindling assets. Richard was desperate for a new line of credit to keep his business afloat, relying on the house's supposed equity. I had anticipated this, because Richard's panic was always predictable. I used a high-level contact from my firm to ensure that Mr. Peterson received an anonymous, sealed envelope 30 minutes before his scheduled meeting. Inside was a certified copy of the quiet title filing, stamped by the Essex County Registrar of Deeds, and a concise 3-page summary detailing the historical fraud involving the calm before the squall. The summary didn't make accusations. It simply presented the official, recorded facts of my mother's reacquisition of the painting and the subsequent legal implication for the ancestral home's clean title. It was a poison pill designed to be swallowed just before the main event. My mother and I stood side by side on the path, separated from Richard by about 15 feet of frozen cobblestone. He was still standing in the doorway, paralyzed by the sight of his ex-wife, the woman he had successfully vilified for 2 decades. The wind picked up, whipping Amelia's coat around her. "Richard," she finally said, holding up the leather portfolio, "I didn't abandon my children and I didn't steal from you. I left because you had already stolen from me and then lied about it to everyone who mattered." She opened the portfolio and pulled out 3 documents, all stamped, sealed, and official. She didn't have to shout. The cultural power of a crisp, notarized document in a community obsessed with property and lineage was louder than any scream. "This is the bill of sale for the calm before the squall from 20 years ago. Note the date. Note the buyer. Note your offshore account number. It's all right here, signed by you, using a power of attorney you manipulated me into signing." She let the silence hang, heavy with accusation. Richard's face was bloodless, his eyes darting frantically, trying to calculate an escape route. He reached out as if to snatch the paper, but Amelia expertly pulled it back. "And this," she continued, holding up the second document, a recently stamped deed. "This is the official registration of the painting's return to the Amelia Trust. The value is assessed at $2.1 million. The asset is mine. It was always mine." He started to speak, a desperate plea for privacy, but his voice was cut off by the unexpected sound of a car door slamming behind him. Mr. Peterson, the chief lending officer, a stern man in a gray suit, was power-walking toward the porch, his face tight with controlled rage. He hadn't just read the summary. He had made a series of urgent calls that had confirmed the filing's authenticity. He bypassed Richard entirely, walking straight to the massive oak door, pulling a business card out of his wallet and taping it to the carved H emblem. It was the public execution Richard Hayes had earned. The lending officer's card, a tiny white square against the dark wood, felt like the official death notice of the Hayes legacy. Mr. Peterson didn't even look at Richard. He looked at me, Clara, with a mixture of professional recognition and profound pity, the expression of someone who understood that my quiet research had just cost his bank millions in potential exposure. He spoke, not to Richard, but into the wind, loud enough for the gathering neighbors to hear. Mr. Hayes, effective immediately, Salem State Bank is freezing all existing lines of credit connected to this address. We are initiating a full forensic audit of the yacht brokerage's assets and its historical collateralization practices. You are to cease and desist any attempt to sell or transfer title of this property until the quiet title action is resolved in court. Your actions have jeopardized the bank's fiduciary duty. Expect to hear from our legal team by close of business today. He then turned, marched back to his black sedan, and drove off, leaving behind a silence that was deafening. Richard finally moved, stumbling out onto the porch, his eyes wide and fixed on my mother. The suit he wore, the symbol of his meticulously maintained status, suddenly looked cheap and ill-fitting. "You did this," he whispered, the accusation weak and hollow. "You finally found a way to destroy me after all these years." Amelia didn't have to defend herself. I stepped forward, finally taking center stage in the drama I had written and directed. "No, Dad," I said, my voice low and steady, carrying the force of 10 years of pent-up truth. "You destroyed yourself 20 years ago when you chose a lie over integrity. Mom didn't come back to take anything. She came back to give you the one thing you've avoided your entire life, the truth about your failure." I pulled the third final document from my mother's portfolio. It was a single page, crisp and new, and it wasn't a court filing. It was a quitclaim deed. "The quiet title action freezes the house, and the bank's audit will financially ruin you. You have lost your business, and you're about to lose your house. But Mom didn't want the house back. She didn't want to watch you bleed. She wanted freedom for both of us." I handed him the deed, which was made out to him. "Richard Hayes, the sole owner. This quitclaim deed is a clean, unencumbered transfer of the Amelia Trust's potential claim on the property's equity, the equity contaminated by your fraud. It clears the path for the bank to proceed directly with foreclosure on your defaulted business loans. We have waived our right to contest the foreclosure. We are giving the bank permission to take everything immediately, cleanly, and without delay." He stared at the deed, confusion and terror fighting across his face. He didn't understand the legal precision. Amelia stepped closer, her shadow falling over him. "I wanted to leave you alone, Richard. Truly alone. You told Clara to leave like I did. Now you will be alone in this house, long enough to understand what you sacrificed for a yacht business, but not long enough to enjoy the view." The ultimate creative vengeance wasn't to take the house, but to force the system he revered, banks, deeds, provenance, to take it from him publicly and irrevocably. He was left with the maximum shame, the maximum debt, and the absolute solitude he deserved, orchestrated by the two women he had underestimated the most. He was no longer the tragic hero. He was just a man, stripped bare on his own porch. The ensuing 3 months were a blur of New England winter, legal filings, and the quiet, satisfying destruction of a toxic legacy. Richard fought the bank, the quiet title, and his own conscience with the same doomed, desperate energy he'd applied to everything in his life. But he was cornered. Every avenue he explored led back to the irrefutable recorded facts of the original painting fraud and the bank's now unavoidable foreclosure. My brother Ethan, the golden son, arrived from his high-powered job in New York, not to defend our father, but to try and negotiate a salvage operation. He was stunned by the documentation I provided, not just the financial fraud, but the decade of gaslighting and lies that had defined our childhood. He finally saw the cost of his gilded privilege, and the realization hit him like a physical blow. We had a long, quiet conversation, the first honest one we'd ever had, sitting in a nondescript coffee shop in downtown Salem. He didn't ask me to stop the foreclosure. He asked for the documentation of the original painting's whereabouts, not to sue, but to understand. That was his change of life. a realization that the legacy he coveted was built on a lie, forcing him to choose a new foundation for his own life and career. He left a week later, not for New York, but for an unpaid internship at a non-profit maritime history museum in Maine, a life free from the toxic weight of the Hayes name. Amelia and I watched the final act play out from my small, light-filled condo in Beacon Hill, a place Richard would have deemed unsuitable. The Marblehead house sold at auction, a quick, clean, and financially devastating transaction for Richard. He walked away with literally nothing, the sale barely covering the combined debts of the bank and the penalty interest. He didn't argue. He didn't scream. He simply accepted the finality of it. The truly unexpected part was not Richard's ruin, but the quiet, dignified path he chose afterward. He moved into a tiny, efficiency apartment above an old bait shop down by the docks, a place he would never have even driven past before. He started working again, not as a broker, but as a groundskeeper for the same yacht club where he used to be a lifetime member. He was seen most days sweeping the docks, his once pristine face weathered by the salt and wind. He had lost his name, his house, and his wealth, but in their absence, he found a quiet, honest dignity that had eluded him his entire life. The vengeance of truth, when delivered surgically, can sometimes destroy the ego and save the man. I had delivered the required punishment, and in doing so, I had given him the space to rebuild his identity without the crushing burden of a fictional legacy. I saw him once, months later, from a distance, while I was visiting a client on the North Shore. He was helping a young boy tie a knot on a tiny sailboat. He looked tired, older, but his smile when he looked at the boy was genuine, the first authentic expression I had ever seen on his face. He was finally living a life of quiet service, free from the crushing weight of pretense. Amelia and I never spoke of the divorce again, nor the wealth, nor the final foreclosure. We spent our time discussing something Richard could never understand, the pure, unadulterated pleasure of working with our hands. She started painting again, large, vibrant canvases that captured the ferocious truth of the Atlantic, not the curated calm of a colonial living room. I spent my days in my studio, restoring beauty and revealing hidden provenance. We found a comfortable, quiet space in our new reality, defined not by blood ties, but by shared truth. The ultimate fascinating end was not the grand collapse, but the subtle, profound change of life it produced for everyone involved. Richard, in his humiliation, found his humanity. Ethan, in his displacement, found his purpose. And Amelia and I, in our act of calculated vengeance, found a lifetime of quiet, unburdened peace. We achieved a true, deep sense of resolution, a feeling of being whole after decades of being fractured. I still visit the Marblehead area often for work. The old Hayes house is now owned by a young couple who have no idea about its history, happily repainting the porch and changing the H emblem. It is simply a house now, no longer a monument to a lie. When I stand on the docks, smelling the salt and the diesel, I look out at the water and I remember my mother's final words to Richard as we drove away that day. "You told my daughter to leave, Richard, and now she is free." And she was right. I drive south, back to my life in the city, where my value is determined by my skill, not my name. I bought a small 18th century painting last month, a tiny watercolor of a dock, unassuming and clean. I authenticated it myself. It hangs on my wall, not as a symbol of vengeance, but as a monument to the clarity that comes from walking away from a beautiful, devastating lie. The truth is the greatest currency, the most potent weapon, and the surest path to freedom. Sometimes the most powerful act of love you can give someone who has betrayed you is to force them to confront the person they truly are, allowing them the only chance they have to build a life worth living. That is the only real justice. That is the true ending. My name is Clara Hayes, and everything you just heard is the absolute, unvarnished truth about the day my mother came back to set us both free. If you've made it this far, you understand that family is a choice, and that the vengeance that matters most is the kind that buys your own peace. Now, I want to hear from you. After everything you've learned about Richard Hayes and the family he thought he had, do you think he finally found true peace working on the docks, or do you believe his shame will haunt him forever? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Be sure to hit that like button to support our channel, subscribe so you don't miss the next story of high-stakes justice, and activate the notification bell so you're the first to know when the truth finally comes out.